David Thompson loved Tuesday mornings. There was something peaceful about rolling his trash can to the curb before sunrise, watching the neighborhood slowly wake up as porch lights flickered on and coffee makers started brewing. He'd been doing this same routine for 3 years now, ever since he bought his house on Maple Street. The quiet suburban neighborhood had seemed perfect when he first moved in. Tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and neighbors who waved from their driveways. But lately, Tuesday mornings had become something entirely different. It started about 2 months ago. David would wake up, grab his coffee, and head outside to bring in his empty trash can, only to find garbage scattered across his driveway like confetti after a party. Banana peels stuck to his car windshield, coffee grounds mixed with yesterday's, rain creating a muddy mess, and plastic containers rolling around his yard like tumbleweeds. The first time it happened, David just shook his head and started cleaning up. Maybe the garbage truck had been careless, or perhaps a strong wind had knocked everything over during the night. These things happen, right? He spent 20 minutes picking up every piece of trash, hosing down his driveway, and thinking nothing more of it. But then it happened again the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. David started paying closer attention. He noticed that his trash can was always tipped over completely, lying on its side like it had been deliberately pushed. The lid would be several feet away, and the garbage spread, in a pattern that didn't look natural. When wind knocks over a trash can, things usually stay somewhat contained. This looked like someone had intentionally scattered everything around. What really puzzled him was that he was the only one on the entire street dealing with this problem. Mrs. Peterson next door never had issues with her trash. The young couple, across the street with their overflowing bins full of baby diapers and takeout containers, their garbage stayed perfectly in place. Even old Mr. Rodriguez at the end of the block, whose trash can was held together with duct tape and good intentions, never had a single piece of litter in his yard, just David's trash, every single Tuesday. He started setting his alarm 15 minutes earlier, hoping to catch whatever was causing the problem. Raccoons, maybe? He'd heard they could be pretty destructive when they got into garbage. But when he peered out his bedroom window at 6 a.m., he never saw any animals. No cats, no dogs running loose, no raccoons waddling away with stolen treasures. The neighborhood was dead quiet, except for the distant hum of the garbage truck making its rounds 3 streets over. David decided to test a theory. He started securing his trash can lid with a bungee cord, making sure it was tight enough that even a determined raccoon couldn't pry it open. Tuesday morning came, and sure enough, his trash was scattered everywhere. But here's the weird part. The bungee cord was still attached to the can and the lid was still secured. Someone had actually untied the cord, dumped out all the garbage, then carefully put the lid back on and reattached the bungee. That's when David knew for certain he was dealing with a person, not an animal. He started thinking about who might have a problem with him. David kept to himself mostly, worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, and tried to be a good neighbor. He always brought his trash cans in promptly after pickup, kept his lawn neat, and even helped Mrs. Peterson carry her groceries when he saw her struggling with heavy bags. There was one person who seemed less than friendly, though. Linda Hoffman lived 2 houses down and had made it clear from day one that she took the neighborhood's appearance very seriously. She was one of those people who measured grass height with a ruler and knew every single rule in the homeowners association handbook by heart. Linda had approached David about 6 months after he moved in, armed with a clipboard and a stern expression. She'd politely but firmly suggested that his mailbox didn't quite match the aesthetic vision of the neighborhood. It was black instead of the traditional white that most houses had, and apparently this was causing some concern among the longtime residents. David had been polite but hadn't changed his mailbox. It was perfectly nice, well-maintained, and there was nothing in the actual HOA rules that required a specific color. He'd checked. A few weeks later, Linda had knocked on his door again. This time she was concerned about his porch light being too bright. She claimed it was shining into her bedroom window and disrupting her sleep. David looked at the standard 60-watt bulb that was identical to every other porch light on the street and offered to install a dimmer switch. Linda had said that would be appreciated by the community. He never installed the dimmer. The light was fine as it was. Then there was the incident with his garden gnome. David had found it charming when he spotted it at a yard sale. A little ceramic figure with a red hat, holding a tiny fishing pole. He'd placed it near his front flower bed, thinking it added a bit of personality to his yard. 2 days later, Linda was at his door with her clipboard again. Apparently, decorative lawn ornaments needed to be pre-approved by the architectural committee to ensure they maintained the neighborhood's sophisticated character. She handed him a form that was 3 pages long and required a detailed sketch of the proposed decoration, including measurements and color specifications. David had looked at the gnome, then at Linda, then at the 3-page form. He'd thanked her for the information and closed the door. The gnome stayed right where it was. Each time Linda brought up these concerns, David had remained polite but firm. He wasn't breaking any actual rules, just Linda's personal preferences for how the neighborhood should look. He paid his HOA fees on time, followed all the real regulations, and minded his own business. But now, with his garbage being systematically destroyed every Tuesday morning, David was starting to wonder if Linda's friendly suggestions had evolved into something more serious. The timing was suspicious. The trash incidents had started shortly after their last conversation about the garden gnome. David decided to pay more attention to Linda's routine. He noticed that she walked her small white dog every morning around 6:30 a.m., always taking the same route that happened to pass directly by his house. She would slow down as she approached his driveway, letting the dog sniff around while she glanced toward his front door and windows. On Tuesday mornings, her walk seemed to take a little longer than usual. David wasn't the type to jump to conclusions or start neighborhood drama over suspicions, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every Tuesday, without fail, his trash would be scattered across his driveway like someone had used it for target practice. Meanwhile, Linda would happen to walk by with her dog right around the time when the mess would have been created. It was time to figure out exactly what was happening on Tuesday mornings, and David had a pretty good idea of where to start looking for answers. David's suspicions about Linda grew stronger over the next few weeks, but he needed proof before making any accusations. He wasn't about to start a neighborhood war based on gut feelings and coincidental timing. So he did what any reasonable person would do in 2023. He bought a security camera. Nothing fancy, just a basic wireless camera from the hardware store that he could monitor from his phone. He mounted it on his porch where it had a clear view of his driveway and trash can area. The camera was obvious enough that anyone walking by would notice it, which David hoped might solve the problem without any confrontation. Tuesday morning came, and David watched the live feed from his bedroom window. At exactly 6:32 a.m., Linda appeared with her dog, following her usual route. She walked normally until she spotted the camera, then suddenly seemed very interested in letting her dog explore every blade of grass in the area. She spent nearly 10 minutes lingering near David's driveway, clearly trying to figure out the camera's range and angle, but his trash can remained untouched that morning. David felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relief because his garbage stayed in the can where it belonged, but frustration because he still didn't have definitive proof of who was behind the previous incidents. Maybe the camera had solved the problem, or maybe Linda was just being more careful. The following Tuesday, David woke up to find his trash scattered everywhere again. But when he checked the camera footage, all he saw was a delivery truck blocking the view at the exact time the incident must have occurred. The timing was almost too perfect. The FedEx driver had stopped to deliver a package to Mrs. Peterson, and during those 5 minutes when the camera was blocked, someone had struck again. This happened 3 more times over the next month. Each Tuesday, something would conveniently block the camera's view right when David's trash got scattered. A landscaping truck doing work across the street, a moving van helping new neighbors, even a city bus that seemed to be running unusually late and stopped right in front of his house for several minutes. David started to realize he was dealing with someone who was not only determined but also pretty clever about avoiding detection. The incidents were clearly planned and timed to coincide with these blocking opportunities. But Linda's behavior was becoming more obvious in other ways. She'd started filing complaints with the homeowners association about David's property. First, She reported that his car was parked slightly over the edge of his driveway, extending maybe 2 inches into the grass. David had to take time off work to attend a hearing where he showed photos proving his car was well within the boundaries of his property. 2 weeks later, another complaint. This time, Linda claimed his garden gnome violated the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. David had to research the actual HOA rules and present a detailed argument about how decorative lawn ornaments were permitted as long as they weren't offensive or commercial in nature. A ceramic gnome with a fishing pole hardly qualified as either. Then came the complaint about his porch light being excessively bright and disruptive to the community. David measured the bulb wattage and compared it to every other house on the street. His was actually dimmer than most. He even took photographs at night showing that his light was barely visible from Linda's house, which was 2 houses away and blocked by trees. Each complaint required David to prepare documentation, attend meetings, and defend himself against accusations that were clearly frivolous. The HOA board seemed annoyed by the constant complaints but felt obligated to investigate each one. David could tell they were starting to recognize a pattern, but they had to follow proper procedures. The most ridiculous complaint came when Linda reported that David's grass was non-compliant with community standards. She claimed it was both too long in some areas and too short in others, creating an inconsistent and unprofessional appearance. David hired a professional lawn service to measure his grass height and provide written confirmation that it met all HOA requirements. During one particularly absurd hearing about the grass complaint, David finally asked the board directly, "Has anyone else on this street received this many complaints in such a short time period?" The board members exchanged glances, and the chairman admitted that David had received more complaints in 3 months than most residents received in 5 years. "And who filed all these complaints?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. "Well, we can't disclose that information," the chairman said uncomfortably. "But I think we can all see there might be a pattern here." David appreciated that the board was starting to understand the situation, but it didn't solve his Tuesday morning garbage problem. If anything, Linda seemed to be getting bolder. The trash incidents were happening earlier in the morning now, sometimes as early as 5:45 a.m. David would hear his garbage can being knocked over, but by the time he got to his window, whoever was responsible had already disappeared. He tried a different approach. David started varying his routine, sometimes putting his trash out Monday night, sometimes Tuesday morning. He tried different locations along his curb. He even borrowed a different style of trash can from Mrs. Peterson to see if that made any difference. Nothing worked. No matter what David did, every Tuesday morning brought the same result: garbage scattered across his driveway like someone had declared war on his weekly routine. The breaking point came when David decided to confront Linda directly. He waited until he saw her walking her dog and approached her with a friendly smile, determined to keep things civil. "Hey, Linda," he said, falling into step beside her. "I've been having some trouble with my garbage can getting knocked over every Tuesday. Have you noticed anything unusual during your morning walks?" Linda's response was perfect innocence mixed with theatrical concern. "Oh my goodness, really? How terrible. I haven't noticed anything. But then again, I'm usually focused on Princess. Here." She gestured to her small white dog who was busy sniffing a fire hydrant. "It's been happening for weeks now," David continued. "Always on Tuesday mornings, always around the time when you're out walking. I thought maybe you might have seen something." "You know," Linda said, suddenly looking thoughtful, "I have noticed that your trash can doesn't seem very secure. Maybe you should invest in one of those cans with a locking lid. The HOA actually has guidelines about preventing unsightly disturbances caused by improperly secured waste containers." David stared at her for a moment, processing what she'd just said. She'd somehow managed to turn his request for help into another criticism of his property maintenance, while simultaneously suggesting it was his fault that someone was vandalizing his garbage. "I'll look into that," David said slowly. "Thanks for the suggestion." As he walked back to his house, David realized that direct confrontation wasn't going to work. Linda was too smart to admit anything, and she was clearly prepared with responses that made everything sound like David's problem to solve. But her mention of the trash can being unsecured had given him an idea. If Linda wanted to keep playing games with his garbage, maybe it was time to make those games a little more interesting for both of them. The situation with Linda escalated dramatically on a Tuesday morning in late October. David had been dealing with the garbage incidents for nearly 4 months now, and his patience was wearing thin. But what happened that morning crossed a line from annoying harassment into actual property damage. David had been up late the night before working on a big project for a client, so he'd overslept and missed his usual routine of watching for trouble. He stumbled outside around 7:30 a.m. to bring in his trash can, already knowing what he'd find but hoping maybe today would be different. It wasn't. But this time, the damage went beyond scattered garbage. His grandmother's antique flower pot, a beautiful ceramic piece that had been in his family for 60 years, lay shattered on his driveway. The pot had been sitting beside his front steps, filled with the last of his fall chrysanthemums. Someone had clearly knocked it over while messing with his trash, and the heavy ceramic had cracked into pieces on the concrete. David knelt down among the broken fragments, feeling a mix of anger and genuine sadness. This wasn't just some random piece of pottery from a garden center. His grandmother had painted those delicate blue flowers by hand back in the 1960s. She'd passed away when David was 12, and that pot was one of the few things he had left. That reminded him of her tiny garden behind her house in Ohio. As he carefully picked up the pieces, hoping maybe he could glue some of them back together, David noticed something else. Footprints in the soft dirt around his flower bed. Small footprints like someone wearing size 6 or 7 shoes. The prints led from the sidewalk directly to where his trash can usually sat, then over to where the flower pot had been, then back to the sidewalk. David pulled out his phone and took pictures of everything. The broken pot, the footprints, the scattered garbage, all of it. He was done being patient and understanding. This had moved from petty harassment to destroying things that actually mattered to him. Later that morning, David was still cleaning up the mess when Mrs. Peterson came over from next door. She was in her 70s, a sweet woman who always had a kind word and usually minded her own business. "David, honey, I saw what happened to your beautiful flower pot," she said, shaking her head sadly. "I'm so sorry. I know how much that meant to you." "Thanks, Mrs. Peterson. I'm pretty upset about it," David admitted. She looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then stepped closer. "Can I tell you something? I probably should have said this sooner, but I didn't want to get involved." In neighborhood drama, David stopped picking up garbage and gave her his full attention. "I've been getting up early lately because my cat has been sick, and I've seen Linda walking by here every Tuesday morning around 6:30. But here's the thing. She doesn't just walk by. She stops, looks around to make sure no one's watching, then goes right up to your trash can." David felt his heart start beating faster. "You actually saw her knocking it over?" "Well, I never saw the actual moment because my view is blocked by that big oak tree, but I've seen her stop here, spend a few minutes doing something by your can, then continue her walk like nothing happened. Always on Tuesdays. Always right around the time your trash gets scattered." Mrs. Peterson patted David's arm gently. "I should have said something earlier, but Linda can be difficult. She filed a complaint about my bird feeder last year, said it was attracting too many birds and they were making noise. I didn't want to make her angry." David understood. Linda had a way of making life unpleasant for anyone who crossed her, and most neighbors had learned it was easier to just stay out of her way. "The thing is," Mrs. Peterson continued, "I don't think she expected to knock over your flower pot this morning. I saw her walking away pretty quickly, and she kept looking back at your house like she was worried someone had seen what happened." This was the confirmation David had been waiting for, but it also made him realize he needed more than just neighbor testimony. Linda would deny everything, and it would turn into a he said she said situation that wouldn't resolve anything. That afternoon, David decided to upgrade his security system. He researched different camera options and found one that connected to multiple cameras with overlapping coverage areas. No more blind spots that could be blocked by convenient delivery trucks. He also started documenting every interaction with Linda and every HOA complaint she filed. David created a detailed timeline showing the pattern of harassment, including dates, times, and descriptions of each incident. He photographed the broken flower pot from multiple angles and saved Mrs. Peterson's statement about what she'd witnessed. But the real breakthrough came when David started talking to other neighbors about their experiences with Linda. What he discovered was that he wasn't her only target. The Rodriguez family at the end of the block had dealt with multiple complaints about their children's chalk drawings on their own driveway. Linda had reported them for defacing community property, even though the kids were drawing on their own concrete with washable chalk. The young couple across the street had received complaints about their baby stroller being left on their front porch. Apparently, this created an unprofessional appearance and violated some obscure rule about temporary storage of personal items in visible areas. Even the Johnsons, an elderly white couple who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, had stories about Linda's behavior. She'd complained about their American flag being improperly displayed because it wasn't perfectly centered on their flagpole. David realized that Linda's harassment wasn't specifically about him being black, though. That might have made him a more convenient target in her mind. She was an equal opportunity neighborhood bully who seemed to get satisfaction from controlling how other people lived their lives. But knowing he wasn't alone didn't make the situation less frustrating. If anything, it made David more determined to put a stop to Linda's behavior before she escalated to damaging other people's property too. The final straw came 2 weeks after the flower pot incident. David had installed his new camera system and was feeling confident that he'd finally catch Linda in the act. Tuesday morning arrived, and David watched the live feed from his phone as 6:30 a.m. approached. At exactly 6:32 a.m., Linda appeared with her dog, but instead of her usual routine, she walked straight up David's driveway, looked directly into one of his cameras, and smiled. Then she calmly walked over to his trash can and knocked it over, taking her time to scatter the garbage around his driveway while maintaining eye contact with the camera. She was taunting him. Linda had clearly decided that since David couldn't prove anything before, and the HOA wasn't going to take serious action based on neighbor complaints, she could do whatever she wanted. The cameras didn't scare her because she knew that even with video evidence, the most she'd face was a stern warning from the HOA board. After she finished destroying his trash, Linda walked back to the sidewalk, gave the camera a little wave, and continued her morning walk with her dog like nothing had happened. David watched the whole thing from his bedroom window, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. Linda had just brazenly vandalized his property while looking directly into his security camera, confident that there would be no real consequences for her actions. That's when David realized that traditional approaches, talking to Linda, filing, complaints, even video evidence, weren't going to solve this problem. Linda viewed the situation as a game, and she believed she was winning because no one could actually stop her. It was time to change the rules of the game. David spent the entire day after Linda's brazen display thinking about how to handle the situation. He had clear video evidence now, but he also knew that filing another complaint would just result in Linda getting a slap on the wrist. She'd already proven she didn't care about warnings or official reprimands. As a graphic designer, David was used to solving problems creatively. When a client wanted something impossible, he found ways to make it work. When technology didn't do what he needed, he figured out workarounds. This situation with Linda required the same kind of creative thinking. David started researching what he could legally do to protect his property. He spent hours reading about property rights, vandalism laws, and legal methods of deterrence. What he discovered was interesting. Property owners had significant rights to protect their belongings, as long as any protective measures were proportional and didn't cause serious harm to others. The idea came to him while he was watching a nature documentary about skunks. Nature had some pretty effective ways of discouraging unwanted behavior without causing permanent damage. David started wondering if he could create something similar for his trash can situation. He began sketching out designs for a modified trash can that would discourage tampering. The concept was simple in theory, but would require some engineering to pull off safely and legally. David wanted something that would activate only when someone was trying to vandalize his property, not during normal use by garbage collectors. The first component was a motion sensor system that could tell the difference between normal handling and deliberate tipping. Garbage trucks lifted cans straight up, while Linda always knocked them over sideways. David could design sensors that would only trigger when the can was tilted beyond a certain angle. The second component was the deterrent itself. David researched non-toxic, biodegradable substances that would be unpleasant but completely harmless. He found recipes for theatrical stink bombs used in movies and pranks, combinations of sulfur compounds that smelled terrible but washed off easily and caused no health problems. For the visual element, David discovered food-grade dyes used in paintball games. These were specifically designed to be safe for skin contact and would wash out of most fabrics, though they might stain for a few days as a reminder. David spent 2 weeks designing and building his deterrent system. He bought a heavy-duty trash can and modified it with a small chamber that would release a burst of purple dye, mixed with a smell reminiscent of rotten eggs and old fish. The system was powered by a small battery pack and controlled by tilt sensors that would only activate if someone tried to knock the can over. The engineering challenge was making sure the system worked reliably but safely. David tested it dozens of times, adjusting the sensors to ensure they wouldn't trigger accidentally. He made sure the dye mixture was completely non-toxic and researched the exact legal requirements for property protection devices. Most importantly, David documented everything. He kept records of his research, photos of his design process, and written explanations of how the system worked. If anyone questioned the legality of his deterrent, he wanted to be able to prove that he'd been careful and responsible in creating it. David also installed additional cameras to capture the area from multiple angles with no blind spots. He wanted clear documentation of what happened when his new system was put to the test. The modified trash can looked completely normal from the outside. David had been careful to hide all the mechanical components inside where they couldn't be seen. To anyone walking by, it appeared to be just a regular garbage container with perhaps slightly thicker walls. David tested the system one final time on Monday night, using a stick to tip the can while he stood safely away. The sensors worked perfectly, releasing a small burst of purple liquid that splattered exactly where someone's feet and legs would be if they were trying to knock over the can. Tuesday morning arrived, and David positioned himself at his bedroom window with his phone ready to record. His heart was beating fast as 6:30 a.m. approached. Part of him hoped Linda would see the new trash can and decide to leave it alone. Another part of him was eager to see whether his engineering project would work as designed. At 6:32 a.m., Linda appeared right on schedule with her small white dog. She walked normally until she reached David's driveway, then paused and looked around as usual. The new trash can didn't look any different from her perspective, so she approached it with her typical confident attitude. David watched through his window as Linda bent down to tip over the trash can, just like she'd done dozens of times before. She grabbed the edge and tilted it sideways with a quick, practiced motion. The deterrent system activated perfectly. A small burst of purple dye shot out from the base of the can, covering Linda's hands, arms, and the front of her white jogging outfit. At the same time, the smell hit her, a concentrated mixture that smelled like a combination of rotten seafood and sulfur. Linda's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She stumbled backward, shrieking loud enough to wake half the neighborhood. The purple dye was already staining her clothes and skin, and the smell was so strong that even David could detect it from his bedroom window. "What the hell?" Linda shouted, staring at her purple-stained hands in shock. "This is insane. This is illegal. You can't booby-trap your property." But even as she complained, Linda was inadvertently providing David with exactly what he needed. A clear confession captured on multiple cameras. Her outburst made it obvious that she'd been the one vandalizing his trash can all these months. Linda tried to wipe the dye off her hands, but it was designed to stick for several hours. The more she rubbed, the more purple her skin became. The smell was clinging to her clothes and hair, creating a cloud of stench that followed her as she moved. "I'm calling the police," Linda yelled toward David's house. "This is assault. This is entrapment." David calmly picked up his phone and called the police himself. When the dispatcher answered, he explained that he had video evidence of someone vandalizing his property and that his legal deterrent system had successfully identified the perpetrator. Within 20 minutes, a police officer arrived to find Linda still standing in David's driveway, covered in purple dye and smelling like a fish market dumpster. Her small white dog had wisely moved several feet away and was looking at his owner with what appeared to be confusion. The officer listened to both sides of the story, examined David's video evidence, and reviewed the documentation David Hay had prepared about his deterrent system. After consulting with a supervisor, the officer informed Linda that David's device was completely legal since it only activated when someone was attempting to vandalize his property. "Ma'am, if you hadn't been trying to knock over his trash can, this wouldn't have happened," the officer explained patiently. "Mr. Thompson has every right to protect his property from vandalism." Linda tried to argue that the deterrent was excessive, but the officer pointed out that the dye was non-toxic and the smell would fade within a few hours. No permanent harm had been done, and the system had only activated because Linda was in the process of destroying David's property. "I've been filing complaints about him for months," Linda protested. "The HOA knows he's been a problem neighbor." The officer looked at David, who handed over a folder containing copies of all the frivolous complaints Linda had filed, along with the timeline of harassment he'd documented. "Actually," the officer said after reviewing the paperwork, "it looks like you've been harassing Mr. Thompson for quite some time. This incident, combined with the pattern of behavior documented here, could constitute criminal harassment." Linda's purple-stained face went pale beneath the dye. She clearly hadn't expected the situation to be turned around on her. The aftermath of Linda's purple encounter spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a high school reunion. By noon, everyone on Maple Street knew what had happened, and opinions were divided in exactly the way David had expected. Some neighbors thought David's deterrent system was brilliant. Mrs. Peterson stopped by that afternoon with a plate of cookies and a huge smile. "I wish I'd thought of something like that when Linda was complaining about my bird feeder," she said with a chuckle. The Rodriguez family gave David a thumbs up when they saw him checking his mail, and even the usually reserved Johnsons nodded approvingly from their front porch. Other neighbors were less enthusiastic. A few thought David had gone too far, that neighborhood disputes should be handled through proper channels rather than elaborate pranks. But when these neighbors learned about the months of harassment and the destruction of David's grandmother's flower pot, their criticism became more muted. Linda herself was nowhere to be seen for the rest of the day. David assumed she was at home trying to scrub purple dye off her skin and wash the smell out of her hair. The real drama started the next morning when David received a formal complaint notice from the HOA. Linda had filed an emergency complaint, claiming that David had created a dangerous booby trap that violated multiple community safety regulations. She was demanding an immediate hearing and calling for David to be fined and forced to remove his illegal device. David wasn't surprised. Linda had always been quick to file complaints when things didn't go her way, and being publicly humiliated by a purple trash can was definitely not going her way. The emergency HOA hearing was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center. David spent Wednesday preparing his defense, organizing all his documentation, and researching the exact legal language around property protection devices. Thursday evening arrived, and the community center was packed. Word about the purple dye incident had spread beyond Maple Street, and neighbors from throughout the subdivision had come to see how the HOA would handle this unusual situation. Linda arrived wearing dark sunglasses and a long-sleeved shirt, but David could still see faint purple stains on her hands and around her hairline. The smell seemed to have faded, though she was sitting far enough away that it was hard to tell for sure. The HOA board chairman called the meeting to order and explained that they were there to address Linda's complaint about David's trash can modification. He asked Linda to present her case first. Linda stood up and launched into a passionate speech about neighborhood safety and the dangers of vigilante justice. She claimed that David's device could have seriously injured her or an innocent bystander. She argued that allowing residents to create their own security systems would lead to an escalation of neighborhood conflicts and potentially dangerous situations. "What if a child had tried to play with that trash can?" Linda asked dramatically. "What if the mailman had accidentally triggered it? This kind of device has no place in a civilized community." When Linda finished, the chairman asked David to respond. David stood up and calmly began presenting his case. He showed the board his documentation of the months of harassment, including the timeline of incidents and the security camera footage of Linda deliberately vandalizing his property. He explained how he'd researched the legal requirements for property protection devices and ensured his system was completely safe and non-toxic. The device only activates when someone is attempting to knock over the trash can, David explained. It doesn't trigger during normal handling by garbage collectors or accidental contact. Ms. Hoffman was only affected because she was in the process of vandalizing my property. David then played the security footage from Tuesday morning, showing Linda approaching his trash can, looking directly at the camera, and deliberately tipping it over while smiling. The room was completely silent, as everyone watched Linda's brazen act of vandalism followed immediately by her shocked reaction to the purple dye. As you can see, David continued, Ms. Hoffman was not accidentally affected by my deterrent system. She was caught in the act of destroying my property, something she's been doing for months despite my attempts to resolve this through proper channels. The chairman asked if any other residents wanted to speak. Mrs. Peterson stood up and confirmed her testimony about witnessing Linda's Tuesday morning activities. The Rodriguez family described their own experiences with Linda's harassment. Even the Johnsons mentioned the complaints Linda had filed about their American flag. As more neighbors shared their stories, a clear pattern emerged. Linda had been systematically harassing multiple families in the neighborhood, filing frivolous complaints and making life difficult for anyone who didn't meet her personal standards. The board members exchanged glances, and David could tell they were realizing the full scope of Linda's behavior. This wasn't just about a trash can dispute. It was about a resident who had been bullying her neighbors for years. When all the testimony was finished, the chairman called for a brief recess, while the board deliberated. David felt confident about his case, but he also knew that HOA boards could be unpredictable. After 20 minutes, the board returned with their decision. After reviewing all the evidence and testimony, the chairman announced, the board finds that Mr. Thompson's property protection device was both legal and justified. The device only activated because Ms. Hoffman was vandalizing his property, and Mr. Thompson had exhausted all other reasonable means of resolving this conflict. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as the chairman continued. Furthermore, the board is issuing a formal warning to Ms. Hoffman for harassment of multiple residents and destruction of property. Any future complaints filed by Ms. Hoffman will be subject to additional scrutiny to ensure they are legitimate rather than retaliatory. Linda shot to her feet, her face red with anger beneath the fading purple stains. This is outrageous. You're taking his side because you're afraid of being called racist. The room fell completely silent. Linda had just said what some people might have been thinking but were too smart to say out loud. The chairman's expression hardened. Ms. Hoffman, this decision is based entirely on the evidence presented tonight. Your behavior toward multiple neighbors, regardless of their background, has been inappropriate and disruptive to our community. Linda stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her. The remaining residents sat in awkward silence for a moment before gradually breaking into small conversations. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. David's purple-stained trash can became something of a local legend, and his Tuesday mornings were finally peaceful again. Linda continued her morning walks but gave David's house a wide berth, usually crossing to the other side of the street when she approached his driveway. The story didn't end there, though. Word about David's creative solutions spread beyond the neighborhood through social media and local news. A video of Linda's purple encounter went viral, with most viewers supporting David's ingenious approach to dealing with a persistent bully. David received messages from people around the country who were dealing with similar harassment situations. Some asked for advice on building their own deterrent systems, while others just wanted to share their own stories about difficult neighbors. The attention made David a bit uncomfortable at first, but he realized that his experience had highlighted a common problem. Many people dealt with neighborhood bullies but felt powerless to stop them through traditional means. David's story showed that sometimes creative thinking could solve problems that official channels couldn't handle. 6 months later, Linda's house went up for sale. David never found out if she moved because of the embarrassment from the purple dye incident or for other reasons, but he wasn't sorry to see her go. The new neighbors who moved in were a young family with 2 small children. They waved when they saw David working in his yard, and their kids drew chalk pictures on their own driveway without anyone filing complaints. David's modified trash can remained in place, though it never needed to activate again. It served as a quiet reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to make their behavior more trouble than it's worth. The neighborhood returned to the peaceful place David had hoped it would be when he first moved to Maple Street. Tuesday mornings were once again his favorite time of the week, when he could roll his trash can to the curb and watch the sun rise over his quiet street, knowing that his garbage would stay exactly where he put it.